Grow your practice, grow your wealth, grow your impact. Find out how to spend less time in the dental chair and more time on the things you love.
Welcome back to the Dental Wealth Podcast. I'm glad to have you back. Got another great episode for you today. Today I'm going to move a little bit directions and talk about organization for a minute. And I'm going to do that because I think it's I'm going to stay on the personal and the business side, but I want you to kind of hear some thoughts on what I call the frustration gap. And write that down, frustration gap, because this is causing a lot of your problems. And what ends up happening, and you know, when you start creating a business, now one of the things I'm constantly preaching about, it's in financial evolution, it's really my philosophy, is that we don't want to be an owner-operator of a business. We don't want to be in there every day. We don't want to be an employee. We eventually want a business that runs without us. We want it to run without us having to be there every day. We want to get out of the dental chair. It doesn't mean you don't practice dentistry. Maybe you love dentistry. Maybe that's like your thing. And so I'm not saying to stop it, but how do you stop the headaches, right? And it's really this concept that I call the frustration gap. Because the headaches are coming from this place. And that's where your problems are happening. So you got to imagine it like this. Well, the first thing, actually, before I even go there, I want to talk about this idea of standards for a moment. And it's something I preach often. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why I preach it so often. Because if you go back and look at Jim Collins when he studied companies that went from good to great, and as I've gotten to spend thousands of, sessions coaching doctors, I realized that the difference between a lot of them, besides their mindset, is their standards for their life. And the difference is they have a different set of standards. Now, they have a different set of standards because they've obviously told themselves a different story usually, and they have a different mindset. So when you have a different story about your potential and you have a different mindset, then you tend to have different standards because you say to yourself, if I'm going to create this, then this is all I'll accept from myself or anybody else. And so we go to work on our mindset. Then we go to work on our, right? When you have a different mindset, you'll start working on yourself and your story and what you believe you can accomplish. And then we move on to our standards. Really important to focus on your standards because Jim Collins said that the difference between good organizations and great organizations was that the great organizations had rigorous standards. Do you have rigorous standards? Do you have rigorous standards for your life, for your marriage, for your health? Right? It's not too long ago, I remember, speaking of standards, I was sitting down and I was actually at a large dental convention and I was sitting there with a group of people. And someone said to me, they were watching what I was eating, and they said, "My gosh, Eric, do you eat like that all the time?" And and what I was consuming was different than some people. And so I said, "I want you to do me a favor." And I said, "I want you to come over with me for a minute. And I want you to walk and look at something." So the person went along with me, and we went around the corner, and this was it was a really nice restaurant that has a very large bar area. And so we go around this corner, and there was a group of gentlemen that were, by the way, I assume they're all doctors, but they were my age. And as they sat on these high top stools, their bellies were, by the way, they all dressed the same. It's like they had a uniform. Like they all wore like the same khaki pants that did not fit. And they probably were, 15 years old. And they wore the same shirt that my grandfather has. And then their stomachs were all like hanging over their bellies. And of course they were trying to attract this waitress because they thought they were still, whatever. So you guys know where I'm going with that. But I want you to hear me. Like, I looked at them and I watched just their skin, their the way they carried themselves. And I said, by the way, I'm not trying to look, we're all on our journeys. Maybe they're on our journeys too. And that's just where they're out in their journey. So I don't want to say it in a disrespectful way. These might be amazing people. But I looked at that group and I said, that's what I don't want to be. And the person looked back at me and they're like, now I understand. Now, it's just because I have a different set of standards for myself. I have a different set of standards for the way I dress. I have different standards for the way I look. It's the way what I eat, what I consume in my body. I coach wealth and leadership. And as a coach of wealth and leadership, the last thing I want to do is allow myself to look like the common person who's my age or live that life. And there's this difference of standards. And so by the way, it's a standard conversation. It's not good or bad. It's not this person's a good person, I'm a good person, he's not a good person. It's nothing like that, okay? So please don't take this as Eric thinks he's better than people or anything like that. It's not that. So don't take it that way. Because I'm not an egotistical type person. It's to say that if you look at successful people, and people that are successful in their lives and in wealth and everything else, you'll see they have a common set of standards. And it's funny. I love that Tower Leadership, people always come back and they always say, I feel like I have to be in shape working here. And it's not that we're I don't have some type of rule about being in shape at Tower Leadership. However, everyone's super in shape, which is kind of interesting. Why? Because you attract what you become. I'll write that down. It's really good. Attract what you become. You attract what you become. You do. And it's interesting that we attract those people. And so what are you attracting? It's the standard. Because go back to what I said, once your story, right? Once you believe a different story and you understand your trajectory and where you can go, you have to set a better standard. Now, I don't care who you are. If you're listening to this going, well, I've got it all figured out. Hell, none of us have it all figured out. We're all striving to get better. But as part of getting better, it's saying that once I've realized that I've got to tell myself this story, I've got to get my mindset right. So we get our mindset right. We tell ourselves a better story. Hey, I can accomplish this. Then you have to go, my gosh, if I'm going to accomplish this, then I know that I can't sleep until 8 o'clock or whatever day. I can't sit on the couch. I've got to be active in my mental state. So when I walk into work, I'm pumped up. And so I have to have a different standards for when I wake up and how I take care of myself physically. And these standards start affecting other standards. They affect your relationship, right? There's a compound effect that affects everything in your life. And then this is what happens next. This is where the frustration gap comes in. Because as your standards raise, let me promise you this, as your standards raise, then your expectations of everyone else's standards will rise. I want to say that again. As your expectations of yourself, as your own expectations rise, so will the expectations you have on everybody else in your circle, your team members, your family. Your expectations will rise. And then we have this gap because you have your expectations of where things should be at, and then you have the person's standards of what they think it's okay to come to work looking like. What they think it's okay to, right, mindset to have, what they believe that they should do at work or do at home. And so this gap between your standards and their standards is where most frustration happens in an organization. Make sense? And it doesn't just happen in an organization. It happens in a marriage too. Matter of fact, think about this. One of the reasons why people get divorced, this isn't marriage counseling podcast, but I want you to think about this. One of the reasons why people get divorced, I hear it all the time. By the way, in my job as doing what I do, I've turned into a marriage counselor over the years too, because I've dealt with a lot of people in some really bad personal situations. Hey, everything affects everything else. And I will tell you one of the things that I find more often than not. More often than not, what happens is one person decides to grow and the other decides to stay the same. Let that sink in for a second. When one person's growing, that's the problem. You've heard the old saying, well, we just grew apart. What growing apart usually means is one person was increasing their trajectory, their expectations, their standards for their life, while somebody else was not. And then that caused frustration. And then that frustration widened over time until what we call irreconcilable differences. And oftentimes irreconciling just means I can't make him or her come up to my level. I've tried to get them to want to grow. I've tried to get them to want to be better, but I couldn't get them there. Isn't that what happens in an organization? Hell, it happens in friendships, but it's what happens sometimes, right? And I label this the frustration gap. And that's what ends up happening is we have to go to work on that gap. For instance, how do you go to work on that gap? Well, one of the ways is companies like Tower Leadership. I'm not here to promote Tower Leadership, but I want you to think about this for a second. Look, I tell people that great organizations are training organizations, right? They're training organizations. The U.S. military, training organization, right? Ritz-Carlton, training organization. Walt Disney World, training organization. Chick-fil-A, training organization. Now that's completely different than an organization that occasionally trains. An organization that occasionally trains is completely different because most of that stuff doesn't stick because they don't stay with the routine. But the reason you do training all the time, nonstop, all the time, I'm just giving you one example, is because what you want to do is you want to increase the standards of the individual team member. As you rise their standards and your standards grow, you'll find that frustration gap gets smaller because what ends up happening is you guys start to become on the same page. In other words, you have to invest in your team members. And then as you start to do that, now watch, this is the kind of cool part that happens. As you start to raise your standards, okay, mindset, right? Story, right? What story you're telling yourself. And as you start to raise your own standards, guess what? And you start investing in the standards of those around you, what will happen is the standards of the organization will start to rise, or you get rid of people that don't have your standards. By the way, look, one of the things you might want to do is get rid of people without the same standards. If you say this person's never going to come up to my standard, there's always going to be a bigger frustration gap with this individual. You might allow them to be successful somewhere else. When I say that, I don't mean, it's not a joking way to say I'm firing. I'm saying they're not going to be successful at your organization, so get them somewhere they can be successful. It's the best thing you can do. By the way, I've let people go at my organization, and I've written letters of recommendation, made phone calls to get them jobs. Just because they're not going to succeed with our company doesn't mean they can't be successful. But by the way, going back to Good to Great, one of the things that Jim Collins said was, good organizations versus great organizations. Good organizations held people way too long. And that was ruthless. Good organizations are ruthless by holding people back from being successful. Great organizations have rigorous standards and they hold themselves and the rest of the team to those standards. And by the way, as you raise the standards of the organization, and you raise the standards and you invest in your team members, you invest in their education, you invest in their personal development. I got doctors coming back and complaining, can you believe that she wants me to pay for her development? Hell yes. That's your team. That's your standard. And you can't come back to me and say, well, Eric, they're frustrated, or I'm frustrated because they're not doing what I want them to do. You haven't helped them, you haven't helped to decrease that gap. Now, Here's the cool part. As your organizational, I always tell people you have hit an organizational ceiling. Okay, so you hit an organizational ceiling by not having the right talent and not doing a lot of things, but that's one of the ways is by having a larger frustration gap, you lower your organizational ceiling, which is the limit at which your organization can grow. Now, what you find is this. As you invest, as you train, as you build, guess what you'll do as the standards of the organization go up, and they will. Guess what happens to your organization? Guess what happens to it? You attract what you become. Write that down again. You attract what you become. Now all of a sudden the standards of the organization are so high that they won't let somebody walk in that door unless they have high standards. And everybody walks in there and they've got great attitudes and they look sharp and they look amazing. And they have high standards for the way we treat patients, and they have high standards for the way we treat each other, and they have high standards for their physical appearance, and they have high standards for their personal education, and on and on and on and on. And then what ends up happening, you'll find out you have a very small frustration gap. And as that talent rises and those standards rise, so will revenues, so will profits, but so will scalability, which is your ability to get out of the dental chair, to attract top talent, and for you to be outside of the practice and it running without you. That's such a huge part of this success. It's such a huge part of this success. So I want you to think about right now, this podcast, what are your standards? Write it down. What are your standards? What do you believe is your standard? It's been said it's got to be a must, not a should. What is your must? I must look this way. I must be this kind of leader. I must have this kind of marriage. I must. So a must is a good way to figure out your standard. I must drive this car. I must. Whatever that is, your must. Write down your list of musts and evaluate them. And then have your team do it. Your spouse do it. Because it's by raising standards that everything else starts to change. Guys, I appreciate you listening. I hope you've enjoyed. Take this material and put it back. Put it back into your life. Put it back into your practice. Look, this is about everything. Wealth is not just about accumulation and money. It's about everything coming together. And that's what I'm committed to helping you do. Listen, if you found this helpful, share it with a friend. That's one of the greatest things. You want to talk about abundance mindset. One of the greatest things you can do is take a video like this and share it. Share it with your colleague. Say, hey, listen, I think this is something you should listen to. Send it to your team. Hey guys, I would love for you to listen to this and let's get back together on our weekly meeting and talk about what do you think about this concept. It didn't even cost you anything but 20 minutes or so. Send it to a friend. One of my standards is I must talk to people and share abundance mindset and thoughts that are provoking and help me grow. Maybe that should be one of your standards, and you share this with somebody and you guys talk about it together. They don't have to be a dentist. Look, this doesn't necessarily just need to be a dentist. Think about a friend that you have that owns a business, or someone who just needs to hear a standard conversation, right? And like it, share it, subscribe it, guys. Look, it gives you a notification letting you know that the next podcast is coming out. And I want to communicate with you as often as possible. So thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. We'll see you next time.